The top title of this session was Building Synergies, Less HIV/AIDS for the Money, Need for Quality, Simplicity, Efficiency, and Effectiveness. It's a pretty broad subject matter, and so I was going to offer some ideas just broadly and then talk about some of the things that we've discussed. I am not someone who has been involved in correctional facility issues a whole lot. And so some of my discussion points will be taken from other contexts, but I think that they're important. I first wanted to just discuss some of the efficiency and effectiveness issues, and those are certainly ranging across a huge spectrum in the HIV prevention and care world. With regard to drugs, there's something that we're going to talk about tomorrow. But just to mention, there's something we at the Gates Foundation are terming treatment optimization, and it has to do with making treatment cheaper and more efficient, and starts at many places. One of the important places is with drugs, and trying to figure out how you can make the drug costs cheaper. Our friends at the Clinton Foundation and CHAI have done a great job at negotiating prices. There's also some additional work that we're doing with the Clinton Foundation about looking at the chemical process for manufacture of drugs, and can that be made more efficient? Can the formulations, different formulations, be made cheaper? Can doses come down? Because in a largely generic-driven market, doses are very related. Prices are very related to doses. Diagnostics, when you look at costing, diagnostics are actually a fairly large cost of care, and they haven't had the pressure for price reductions in the same manner that drugs have. And I think that there is a need for point-of-care tests, which by definition have to be very simple, and a piece of plastic with a piece of paper that you read a couple of lines on, and then by definition are going to be much cheaper than something that is a system that relies heavily on optics or something. So that's somewhere we also need to be striving for. Certainly the management of patients and integration of services are going to be very, very important. I think one of the big examples, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, is the integration of TB and HIV services and screening and treatment. And Robin Wood, who is here, is the master of that and has got the best data around about integrating good TB care services into HIV care. The task shifting is something we've all talked about, and the efficiency of delivery. It's much more efficient if you catch somebody who comes in for the first time for care than if they come in for the fourth time, or they get their diagnosis at the first time they present rather than the second or third, or they get their TB screening the first time they come in. Mark Harrington reminded me last night that the most important way around treatment is that the regimens need to be durable, so that you have one treatment regimen that is lasting for someone's entire life. I loved your cascade. I thought that was really important on the cascade on seek, test, treat, and retain. And I think that there are many cascades that are available, and we need to think about. There's the PMT-CT cascade, there's the HIV diagnostic cascade, there's the care cascade, there's the TB screening and diagnosis cascade. And each one of these things that we're looking at is probably best dissected down into these cascades, and looking at the individual steps and saying, does the step need to happen? And if it does, how can it be made more efficient, and how can you lose fewer people from it? I think many times the cascades are not actually well understood, so it's an important thing to look at that. I very much applaud your thinking about the harmonization, and what is clear is a lot of hard work that's gone into this, and that this is not an easy thing to do, but it's a very, very important thing to do. It's something that I've been thinking about with regard to these studies, as Ruben mentioned, as regards to treatment for prevention and combination prevention studies. I think that we at the Gates Foundation in communication with OGAC have been thinking about ways of perhaps thinking and enabling the U.S. government, at least in the studies that they're going to be doing, to think about this manner of harmonization. And we've had the questions about how do you do it, how do you get the buy-in, how do you make it. So your examples were really important, and I think the stuff that you will be putting up on the web will be very interesting. One of the examples of this that I was involved in my early days at the Gates Foundation was around the first generation microbicide trials, which were these polyanion coitally dependent gels, vaginal gels that women used that were thought to be effective or were being tested for efficacy against HIV as well as other STIs. And there were several that were being tested at one time. And we can get to harmonization of trial design because that's an issue I want to come back to. But in the studies that were being performed, we thought it was important to think about trying to harmonize the data collection, what's being collected out of those. And these were fairly simple studies, placebo-controlled, coitally dependent gels, and with common endpoints, HIV and other STI acquisition. And even harmonization across what appeared to be very, very similar study designs and probably, you know, fairly easy endpoints to accomplish. There was a lot of things that we learned just by looking at this, and that the definition of HIV infection wasn't even the same in these studies, that the way that the SAEs were being measured and recorded was different, how the STIs were being diagnosed, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were able to, you know, do some thinking across that, and it was a lot of work. And I can only think that with things that are much more complicated, such as the combination prevention, multiple interventions, multiple ways, multiple different communities that are being looked at, that this harmonization is going to be very, very challenging, but all the more important. And thinking about it. The layers of harmonization was very interesting. So, you know, how many studies need to be done, and how do you optimize the studies? And Ruben has been working on a catalog of these studies, and there are quite a few, and I was surprised when I read it as to how many there were, and, you know, what are the best ways to move forward when you've got this this smorgasbord of studies that are being planned, and then how do you make this harmonization work, and the need for the iterative work that's going to be on that. The governance is going to be interesting, and I think that we're going to have to see how that happens. One thing that I think is also really interesting is the discussion of how to involve the policymakers. And I think it's actually going to be important, acknowledging that the stuff Rodano was talking about do not have policymakers, but a good example that I can think of was with male circumcision, which unfortunately we are not doing so well on. It's been 4 years since the guidelines came out. The data could be no more rigorous than it is. There is an estimated need of 50 million circumcisions, and 500,000 have been accomplished in this time period, so we cannot call that any kind of victory. But when you go to policymakers and when you say, well, you know, what's going on and why hasn't this been picked up? You know, these were studies that were done by surgeons doing techniques that are very, some cases quite complex and require a good bit of training. And no policymaker is going to say, I can take my surgeons, of which there are so very few, who need to do emergency appendectomies and need to do emergency cesarean sections and do circumcisions. And so the follow-up studies are being designed very much with the policymakers in mind, in the sense that we're saying, okay, what cadre of healthcare worker can do these? Can nurses do these? And let's look and see, and we can get the safety and effectiveness of this procedure done by nurses and compare it to doctors. Something that's near and dear to my heart is the use of devices that make this whole procedure happen much more quickly, and also will be a way that will be making it much more acceptable to policymakers. So I think it is important to think about that as we move forward. I am even more convinced at the end of this good talk by Rodano of the need for harmonization and how we need to be get ahead of this as much as we can and think about this and move ahead. And that's all I've got. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.